Hello and welcome to 3ABN Today. My name is C.A. Murray, and allow me once again to thank you for sharing just a little of your day with us. To thank you, as always, for your love, your prayers, your support of 3 Angels Broadcasting Network, as together we seek to warn the world and encourage men and women to the fact that Christ is coming soon, and we must be prepared for that day. But while we are preparing for that day, Christ has called us to live and to occupy and do the very best we can to be the hands and feet of Jesus here and now on planet Earth. And that's what this program is all about. We're going to be talking about ADRA, A-D-R-A, the Adventist Development and Release Agency International. And we're going to kind of walk our way through that. My guest is Jonathan Duffy. Jonathan, good to have you here.
Pleasure to be here, C.A.
Now, let me start right off by saying that lilting accent that we just heard tells me you're not from Brooklyn.
I'm a little further south.
Yeah.
Down in Australia.
Indeed. In Australia. We're
in the
Australia.
colonies.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I grew up in Adelaide in South Australia, but
Okay.
I spread my professional career between Melbourne and Sydney, and the last 15 years before I moved to the US was spent in Sydney.
Adventist home growing up?
It was. I was born to Adventist parents. My father was a teacher in the Adventist school system. My mother was a nurse.
Okay. Adventist home, brothers and sisters?
I've got one sister, 2 brothers.
And you are wearing that line of food?
I'm the baby.
You know,
No matter how old you are, you're
yes,
always the baby.
Always the baby.
Always the baby.
They say many things about the baby. The baby can go into many, many different kinds of directions. It is one thing, Jonathan, as you well know, to grow up in an Adventist home. It is another thing to know Christ for yourselves. I mean, you can have the accoutrements of Adventism, but it's one thing to be surrounded by Adventism, another thing to be Adventist or to be in Christ. When did that realization come to you? And I asked that in light of some things we talked about, because you were a I don't want to say ne'er-do-well, but you were working your way to be a pretty good footballer, Australian rules footballer, but some of that was kind of truncated because you couldn't play on Sabbath. But walk me through that, and then when Christ became real to you as a person.
Well, you know, it's difficult to actually say when Christ became real to me as a person. While I did grow up in an Adventist home, I grew up in a fantastic local church. And right from a young age, that local church gave me responsibility. I remember, you know, I was a deacon at the age of 15 or something, and my dad thought, wow, that was a bit young, you know, should they be asking you to do that?
Yes.
But, you know, when your church nurtures you, when they create a community around about you, when the adults in your church community model Christ to you, then that shapes the way you are for the rest of your life.
It does.
The opportunities they give, you know, I've had the opportunities to speak to large audiences, to give speeches all over the world, to meet presidents of countries, and really when they got me to stand up in Sabbath school, you know, on Mother's Day and Father's Day and recite poems and gave me responsibilities and things.
Yes.
So I grew up within that community, and I think that, you know, as I matured, I was fortunate enough that I got the chance to take on more responsibility. So at the age of 18, when I graduated from high school and went to university, then I was given the opportunity to provide youth leadership within the conference in South Australia, and start to put on youth for other activities and lead out in summer camps, and all of those things are what shape you for your future. And I think, you know, that's what made Christ always just an integral part of my life. You know, I chose baptism at the age of 13 years of age. I think a pivotal time for my career was when I was working at a residential healthcare centre. I was running the church owned in the Yarra Valley in Victoria. They owned a residential lifestyle health centre, a health resort, and they had a hospital attached which also ran drug and alcohol rehabilitation. And people who come to a health resort don't just come to get healthy. They start to talk to you about diet or exercise or something else, which I've fallen down on a little bit lately. But you know, the reality is that once you start talking to them, they talk about life, and they talk about all their issues. And so you're there consumed all the time. And I needed a break. You know, the church was selling the facilities. What was my next step in life? And I took time out, and I thought, I've got to get some time. I hadn't had annual leave. And so I chose to ride my bike. I was living in Melbourne back to Adelaide where my parents lived. So it was only a short ride. It was only about 500-600 miles. And so I decided that I did some family things, some family vacations, but I said, you know, sometimes your ministry drains you, and it's a great gift, but sometimes you get so busy in the gift, you forget the giver.
Yeah, it pulls from you. It does.
So,
Yeah,
you know, I took that time and I said, I'm riding my bike because I want aloneness. And you know, if we had time, I could fill the hour with what happened to me on that journey, of the people whose lives I was in contact with the changes. And I'm thinking, I'm trying to get away from all this need, but I constantly reminded. And, you know, I didn't know what my future was. I didn't know where my career was going to go when they sold. I was beginning to get lucrative offers from, you know, Hilton to set up a new spa resort for them.
Now, you were in college or done with
professional
college?
Sports. This is when I'm about 15 years into my career, 20 years into my career.
Oh, wow.
And that ride, you know, people begin to, like, I used to work with the wealthiest people in Australia. They were my clients. You look at what they've got, you think, well, you know, it'd be nice to own a Ferrari or to live in a big house. But that journey just got me reconnected and got me, you know, founded. And what did I want in life? And as I met people along the way and was able to impact their lives, it reminded me that I'm here to serve.
Yes.
And it put to bed any aspirations that I wanted to go and chase the big dollars. And I think ever since then I've felt really settled into serving a God in whatever He wants for me. I've never worried about what's it going to pay or whatever else. It's just like, as long as I'm where God wants me to be.
Yeah.
And so in my adulthood, I actually see that as my pivotal moment. You know, it was the middle of winter. I didn't want to get rained on, and you know, you can see rain coming towards you. And I never got wet. Rain came almost to the fences on the side of the highway, and I didn't get wet. I parked my bike under shelter, poured with rain when I ate. I came out, it stopped raining. God was present in a special way that just touched my life. And
so that alone kind of focused you.
It really did.
Let me ask you this, because, and you've almost pre-answered my question, because you got involved in the church so early and so strong, and that parallels my experience in the church, Emmanuel Temple Church in Buffalo. They took the young people, they made them deacons fairly early on. They gave them responsibilities. They gave them reasons to be in the building on Sabbath, functioning, not just sitting. But I suspect that you didn't really have time to have what we might call wilderness years, or years when you were kind of running away from the Lord, doing your own thing, because you were involved so early, so often.
And I think that's, you know, that's interesting, because when you look for, you know, what was that real pivotal moment, it wasn't during my growing up years. It was actually when I was working for the church, and I was very involved, and you know, you can be over-consumed.
Oh, yes.
And sometimes we get so busy that we lose that spiritual connection. And so it was really in the busyness of my ministry that I became more aware of the fact that don't let the busyness take you away from your relationship.
Well said.
And that's really was the pivotal thing that I've had to learn from that. And, you know, I have a big job in ADRA, but the reality is, what that reminds me is my dependence upon Christ.
Upon Christ. Well said. Your actual college area study is in? My area,
original degree was in the area of physical education and human biology and exercise physiology. Yeah.
Where and when did you meet your wife?
I met my wife when I first graduated. The church offered me a job at this health resort, which I left and went to work for Sydney Adventist Hospital, came back, taught for a couple of years, and she was a pharmacist at the hospital there. So, you know, I met her while she was off trying to peddle drugs. And
Indeed. Did you know kind of early on, or did it have to sort of grow on her and grow on you?
Well, it actually grew on me. So she doesn't like me telling this story. But she was going through a hard time in life, and I was the youth leader in the local church, and I thought, you know, you should always be inclusive of people. So, you know, I made sure that she was included in all of the things, and you know, that she had a community there to support her at the time, and that she needed it. And, you know, I thought I was just being a good Christian guy, and she thought I was interested. And the rest is history.
And the rest is history, indeed. How long ago did you come to the States?
5 years ago.
Oh, so not that long.
No.
No. Was it a big change for you?
You know, the biggest change for me, I mean, Australia in the 60s was Little Britain.
Yes.
And TV came, and we became Little America. So when moving to the States was not such a big cultural change, but the interesting things you don't think about, is trying to get your car insurance.
Yes.
Because, you know, suddenly they're asking me for $500 a month car insurance. And I'm saying, I've already bought the car, I don't need to lease it.
Right.
I just want insurance, you know. Oh, but you don't have a driving record. I say, I have a perfectly good driving record.
Yes,
you know, or they say to me, well, you know, what about a credit card? Well, you've got no credit history. And I said, well, look, here's the letters from my bank in Australia. You know, I've got a perfect credit record. No, you've got to start from scratch.
Yeah,
said,
yeah.
Well, how do I get a credit rating?
Yes.
They say, well, you've got to borrow money. And I said, I don't want to borrow money.
Yeah.
You know, well, then give us your money and we'll loan it back to you.
Right.
And it has a secured loan. I said, that's not business.
You know, think about those little day-to-day sort of rubber meets the road kinds of activities that you've got to do when you're establishing yourself in a brand new country.
Exactly.
Yeah. Did you have children when you came over?
I did. Both my children were still in Australia, or actually my daughter was in Namibia. So my son is still living in Australia. My daughter, you know, followed after me a little bit. She did journalism. She did sports journalism, actually. Yes. and then she also did a law degree. And so she wanted to sort of work in sports, and by the time she finished university, she was convicted in wanting to make a difference in the world in human rights. So she worked for Transparency International, which is a big international human rights group, and did an internship in Berlin. And she lived for 2 years in Namibia, working with a local NGO group on human rights advocacy. And then she ended up coming to work for ADRA and works at ADRA International.
That's all.
She's come across, but my son's still back in Australia.
Was it rough on your wife making that change? Was she all for it, or was she?
Well, you know, it was interesting. We didn't talk a great deal about it, but by the time the actual, you know, I was asked, we were both really led to feel that that's where God wanted us to be.
Praise the Lord.
So from that point of view, it was an easy decision. From the point of view of the fact that we had elderly parents, and you know, in the last 4 years, we've lost all of them, and you know, both my parents, her parents. Leaving the kids behind was tough for her.
Oh, yeah.
So there's always a transition when you move, but there's always a sense of peace when you know that you're doing what you should be doing.
Praise the Lord. I've got to ask you then, Jonathan, because what in your history, in the trajectory of your life, led the brethren to call you to ADRA International? That's a very specific set of skills, a specific ministry. Sure. What commended you to the brethren to that position? Well,
I was the health director for the Adventist Church for the South Pacific region. Okay. And as such, I was on the board for ADRA Australia. And then a position became vacant. They were looking for a new country director for ADRA Australia. And the division president contacted me and he said, we'd like you to take the job. Well, I was on a health trajectory. I'd been talking to, you know, the health guys at the general conference and so forth. And you know, they said to me, ADRA is unique. You know, ADRA is a business.
It is.
Someone, you've been involved in healthcare, you've run businesses. It's community development in your background. I did my master's in public health and health promotion. And, you know, working in the Pacific, in developing countries, in primary public health initiatives. You understand development theory. But they said, you know, ADRA has a tendency towards maybe being it's an NGO, a non-government organization. Is it really a faith-based organization? And we'd like to see ADRA and the church closer together. I see. And so they said, we think that you've got a unique set of skills. We'd like you to come and work for ADRA. So, well, you're my boss, you know. Yeah. And then over the time that I was with ADRA Australia, you know, we were able to strengthen the national program. We were able to, you know, when I left, around 25 to 30% of the churches were actively involved in their communities. We were able to resource them and help them in that. We had ADRA as a strong business model, but ADRA as a strong faith-based organization. Yes. And they said, that's what we would like ADRA to look like globally. So that was the step, really.
So this idea that ADRA is it's a business per se, but with strong faith-based underpinnings, foundations, that you want to sort of lift up. You want to highlight that idea. We're not just out here. We're out here because Christ sent us out here, and we're part of a church group.
So, you know, if we look at ADRA, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, then, you know, we have 141 country offices around the world. We bring aid to 20 million people a year. Yes. We're a professional organization. We're trusted with significant funding by national governments, by multinationals. And it is a business in a way, but what is its real business? You know, what's the mission of the business? What's
Right.
the purpose of the business? So when I look at what we can accomplish, there's much to be proud of what we can accomplish. And development is long-term, sustainable change, giving people the resources to be able to create a more positive future, and being there when their lives are in distress is a wonderful thing. But what does it mean to be the Adventist Development and Relief Agency? And that's the challenge of it. And you know, if I look at historically, if I can take a minute to go through history, if we look at social reform in society, the abolition of slavery, the hospitals were set up by churches to serve the community. Education was set up by schools, by churches to help people educate, to lift them into more of an opportunity. Prisons were set up originally by churches in order to create reform. So church was an agency of change in society and an advocate for positive social change. When World War I occurred, what happened was that the whole world went to war. They saw it in such atrocities that people said, we can no longer change society. And churches became lifeguards. The lifeguard is rowing around in his boat of this drowning mass of humanity, and they're pulling one life at a time into the boat to save. And then we saw the rise post-World War II of secularism, and people wanted to say, we've got the physical world and we've got the spiritual world. The physical world is the real world. The spiritual world is your own personal world. You know, your spirituality of who you understand or what doctrines you believe or whatever else, but that's your private life. The rest of the time you live in a physical world, which is a world of, you know, material things, of politics, of power. And so churches were seen to be that when you're praying, when you're doing this, that's in your spiritual dimension, but the rest of the time you live in the real world. And they separated it. But now society has actually made a change. A few years ago, the German government published a paper on the role of religion in development. And what they have come back to realizing is that 85% of the world's population is affiliated with some form of religious order. Yes. That when we look at the positive change within society, that the biggest agents of change are faith leaders in communities. You look at the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone and Liberia. The government had public health messages out there about hygiene, about other things. People didn't change. But when the pastors and the priests and the imams from the mosques and the churches and the temples began to convey the messaging, people changed their behaviors. Well said, So now they're looking to say, we can't change the world. We can't end poverty. We can't end starvation if we don't learn to partner with faith leaders and faith communities. And I want to stop you there before we go to our music, because that gives us a strong pivot into what ADRA does. And I think that's a good foundation, because for many, many years, the question was 70s, 80s, early 90s, immediacy and relevancy. Is the church relevant? Is God even relevant? Yes. The question has been answered, I think, to an assurity that if we're going to make some changes, church has to be part of it. Religion has to be a part of it. In fact, is a part of it, whether we recognize it or not. And I think that's where you're going with that. We want to take this point to go to our special music. Then I want to come back and sort of spend a lot of time mining this and how ADRA addresses and redresses these issues, and how Jonathan sort of sits atop that and sort of directs the movements of this really God-blessed and God-used agency. Our music today is coming from Valerie Shelton Walker, and she's going to be singing, His Strength is Perfect.
Sometimes I wonder what he can
Thank you, Valerie. She's a good friend of this ministry. Her husband, Brad Walker, director here for many, many years, and we all love Valerie very, very much. My guest is Jonathan Duffy. He president of ADRA International, and that's what we're going to talk about. And Jonathan, I want to go to something very quickly, because there's so many things happening around the world that ADRA is a part of. But what is very, very close to our heart and the heart of many Americans is Puerto Rico.
Right.
So much has happened there, and I know ADRA is on the ground. So give me just a little flavor of what's going on, what ADRA is doing in Puerto Rico.
So, I mean, as we're aware, Puerto Rico was just devastated with Hurricane Irma. And so one of the first things is, you know, what do we do in the immediate response? And we're able to partner with the local Adventist Church. The local Adventist Church has a number of young people who are medical cadets. And so they were able to go around the communities, treat people with sores and things like that on a fairly instant basis. The challenge of a disaster is what happens post the disaster. And so little things like cuts and so forth that would not have been a problem, suddenly when you haven't got clean water, sanitation, then infection comes out. So it was really important to work with them and also partner with the church there in removing some of the waste, because, you know, where there's waste, there's mosquitoes, there's the likelihood of other diseases. One of the big challenges has been the recovery of safe potable, what we call potable, safe drinking water. And so we've been working around restoring that to some of the communities there as well. We've been feeding around 40,000 people with produce to be able to create their own foods, and feeding 10,000 people with hot meals as well. And the government's given us 5 schools to look after there. So one of the things in the cases of a disaster is normal life gets disrupted.
Yes.
So what we don't want is children to miss that stage of education in their lives, and suddenly they're penalised for the rest of their lives because they didn't get education. And so restoring the education system is important. And restoring the buildings is one thing, but restoring the schools to be a safe place. When I say a safe place, then how do we provide for the sanitation needs? And we have a technical term, that's sort of technical, called WASH, which is water, sanitation, health. So in restoring the schools in Puerto Rico, we've been working with the government there in order to be able to restore safe potable water for the kids at school and sanitation for the kids at school. So that when they go to school, they're not only given the opportunity to experience education, but they're also kept safe, and they're not going to get sick at school.
Is your focus Adventist education, Adventist schools per se, or just any school anywhere?
No, we work in communities. Often what happens in the case of a disaster is you're assigned a particular region. So we're assigned a certain number of schools that we're responsible for. We will treat the Adventist people within that community, and we'll treat the non-Adventist people within that community. So we respond more on a regional level. The church itself tends to respond more to their members, and we tend to be the church's agency, which helps to the general population. And so we've been given a region within Puerto Rico, which is our region.
I see. I am so glad to hear you say that. I watch CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC. You know, you hear all of these things, and you hear the rub up between the government in Puerto Rico, and so many things are going on. But you rarely, if ever, hear that there are NGOs, there are church-based groups working and doing a fantastic work that goes unsung and unheralded. Yeah,
and you know, what makes me really proud about ADRA as well is that when we respond to situations like Puerto Rico, in 3 years' time, you'll find us in Puerto Rico. You know, in 5 years' time, hopefully not forever. I mean, we've always got a presence there. We have a but the challenge is that sometimes when a disaster occurs, people come in while the cameras are rolling. When the cameras aren't rolling, they're gone. And the next piece of news, they're gone. But we tend to stay in communities. You know, it took us 10 years before all the communities had cleared up after the tsunami that hit Asia. It took us 5 years to finish with the communities after Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. So we are not just a disaster response organisation, we're a development organisation that works with helping the communities to restore completely before we actually leave. So it's a long-term as well as the short-term intervention, which is important. That's when you build relationships. That's when you have an impact in community.
Yeah, I remember going in after the earthquake in Haiti, And I'm trying to think of the name of the fellow who was in charge.
Fritz. I'm trying to think of his surname now as well.
Yeah, that won't come to me.
I always call him Fritz.
Yeah, but how hard ADRA worked there in Haiti, and for a protracted period of time to do what needed to be done. Yeah.
And you know, it was fortunate too that the church had a hospital there as well, when it became a great base in helping people, because you know the disaster was of such a nature. There was so much death, so it's so much, you know, brokenness and broken limbs and cuts and things, that it was a really important part of that. And then different parts of the church helped with ADRA, which is this, because we're a church agency, and that's where the benefit of being a church agency is. And you know, doctors in Loma Linda came in with orthopedic surgeons and other factors, and you know, other health systems combined as well. And so it became an all-of-community response. Yeah, yeah.
Let's then, Jonathan, let's do this. Let's sort of scan the world and talk about some of the places. Sadly, there are many that ADRA has had to step in and do its thing, you know, to come in and try to you know, lift up.
So while we're on the sort of the emergency response, the one that's probably the hottest at the moment is the Rohingya crisis. So what we've got is an ethnic group living in Myanmar that's been denied citizenship for a number of years. And so now they're being forced out. And, you know, to sort of paint the picture, I don't want to paint too bad a picture for
well, if you had the news on you, and you've heard Rohingya, you've heard...
When people come in, you know, they come in with gunships, helicopters, blasting rockets, shooting, and all the other atrocities that happen with destroying and setting kids on fire, and people see this and they run. They don't have time to grab anything. So now we've got 800,000 people in Bangladesh, and I was just there a couple of weeks ago doing a food distribution. So we've been able to provide shelter for 12,000 households, about 60,000 people. We've helped them to build, you know, bamboos and sheeting to keep them dry and so forth. And you know, last week we fed 100,000 people and gave them food for 2 weeks to sustain. And the World Food Programme, WFP, the United Nations, gave rice, and we gave all the other staples. And that was fortunate in that that was private donations. So that was where people had helped ADRA, and that's the real way that donations do get there, and we're able to feed 100,000 people. But it comes down to the real life stories. And I was talking to a person, him and his wife and his 4 children were in a small little place. It's not particularly big, it's 1 room. And that's what their living space is. It's got plastic, which keeps them dry, and a mat down, but they're sleeping on hard ground. And I said, what was like before this? So, you know, we often don't think of what they've lost, because, you know, we look at what we've got. But he owned a business, he had a store. They lived in a nice home. They had 2 bathrooms between him, his wife, and 4 children. The 6 of them had 2 bathrooms. Now he shares 2 bathrooms with 450 people. There's no shower facilities or washing facilities. And, you know, the big challenge that we also have is water, because there's different refugee camps. This particular one is near the coast. So when you drill for a well, you get salty water. That's a problem for growing crops, and it's also you can't drink. So along with the United Nations, we're having to ship all the water in. And we don't actually see a short to medium term solution. So you imagine this particular camp has got around 200,000 people. Can you imagine the logistics of having to truck water in for 200,000 people? So we can probably provide the water that's necessary to keep them alive and drink. But what about all the bathing and the washing of the clothes and everything else that goes with that, and the hygiene factors of it? And that's really this crisis. And the crisis is created, you know, we respond to natural disasters, we're responding to floods, we've responded to the hurricanes in Puerto Rico and other parts of the Caribbean and so forth, and provide water and shelter and so forth like that. And, you know, I think there's some pictures I'll put up at the screen of that. But what really strikes home is we have the largest number of refugees and internally displaced people in the world's history. And what's caused it? Man's inhumanity to man. You know, this is not a natural disaster. This is man-caused disasters that are causing people to flee, to run, to seeing family members lost and shot in front of them, the trauma that goes with that. And I believe that as a faith-based organization, we have a role to give people hope and healing in those circumstances.
Yeah. You do good because good is what good people do. As I recall, the Rohingya population is Muslim, are they not?
That's right.
All right. And that's one of the reasons why they're being driven out of Burma, Myanmar. And if you've been following this whole thing, this is a humanitarian disaster and crisis.
Yes.
It makes me very proud of my church and of ADRA that even though they're not getting the kudos, you don't see them on the 6 o'clock news, they're on the ground and they're doing it, man. They're in there pitching in for people who cannot help themselves and this is not a political show, but these people are being driven out, their villages are being burned, their children are being, it's a horrible situation. It is so comforting to me to know that ADRA is there. And if one of them becomes Adventist or Christian, praise the Lord. If none of them do, we still praise the Lord because you're doing what Christians are supposed to do. You are the hands and feet of Christ. So I give you kudos for that. I really do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's what drives us. That's what makes us get up in the morning, and that's the passion that God places in our hearts. And for me, being the head of a faith-based organization, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, I don't want 20 million Adventists to be proud of an agency. I want 20 million Adventists to see themselves as an agent of hope and healing in the brokenness that exists.
Well said.
I mean, you don't have to go far outside your front door to find brokenness. And we all need to be agents of hope and healing. And how do we help the church to understand that role? How do we help society at large to understand that role, that we have a responsibility to love your neighbor as you love yourself?
Two things. I don't suspect we can get into Myanmar and help. Is the government of Bangladesh receptive? Are you receiving any static for the work you're doing? Are they working with you to help?
They're working with us to help.
Praise the Lord.
So it's a cooperation. Whenever you do these things, if you want to make it sustainable, then you actually have to get into a little bit of that relationship and work with governments and work with the United Nations and work with multinationals and corporations and so forth. It takes a community to surround people, to help them in that brokenness. And I'm glad that we have a role to do that. And I'm glad that we are acknowledged as a part of that community. You think of the privilege that it is for us to be able to have that impact in a person's life at a point of crisis in their lives. For that they let you in to be able to help. To get over their own fears and to recognize that there's love out there. And I think we face these times of the world when there's too much hate speech out there.
Oh yeah, very much so.
And there's too much xenophobia. America for Americans, Britain for Britons. And all of these other messages. And where's the people who are speaking love? Where's the people who say, hey, listen, you know what? There's hope amongst all of this. And that's what it means to be working for a faith-based organization.
Yes, praise the Lord. I agree so much. So many things are running around my head that the world is really a very small place. And when somebody bleeds and hurts over there, there's a direct line, even as through the heart of Jesus, to you, and a call to try to redress that. Let's do this. Let's break out of this, and let's just run through some pictures, and let's look at some of the things that you're doing. Then I want to come back and talk about some other hot spots that you're addressing. So let's look at some of these graphics and give an idea of...
This is one of the young children that we're helping in the Rohingya crisis at the moment. It's nice to see a smile on the face despite all the trauma. This again is an elderly mother with her grandchild in the Rohingya crisis. The challenge is that, where are the parents? What happened to them in all this trauma? And I think that may still be that.
I mean, this is you. I mean, we could run picture after picture.
Of all the different pictures and the stories
major.
So let me, while we're rolling through those, let me maybe just tell you a couple of stories as well. This is the Mexico crisis that we were able to be there when the earthquake struck.
Oh yes.
And you know, there's some pictures coming up of where we were able to respond in Nepal, and we went to a community. It had a scarcity of food. What we were able to do there was we helped them. We taught them agricultural techniques, identified groundwater sources. This is actually Madagascar. And I traveled with the head of the World Food Programme, the United Nations, into this area.
Yes.
And it has not rained there since 1995.
Oh, my soul.
And the 4 wells are drying up. Well, 3 have dried up and there's only 1 left. And all they've got is enough water to sustain their life. So planting crops and getting food is a real struggle for them.
Sure.
And, you know, we've got to bring in new drilling wells. We've got to actually drill deeper to get down to the groundwater.
Yes.
You know, what do you do when you're out of water there? And she said that it was one of the worst cases that she's seen, you know, of malnutrition. And you look at malnutrition, you put a band around a child's arm and you realize that their development has not taken place.
It's not taking place, yeah.
And often what we'll see, it's not shown in these pictures, is you see some of these kids who naturally should have dark hair and it's orange hair. And that's a sign of significant nutritional deficiency. So we take their arm measurements and you can see it. And Eartha Cousins, who was the head of the World Food Programme, said this is actually the biggest, this really confronted her of all that she's seen of these people in Madagascar.
Wow.
And, you know, I started to talk about the situation in Nepal. And so we worked with this community that had a scarcity of food. We helped them to develop crops and to grow crops. And then we were able to give them literacy, numeracy skills. And with their excess food that they now had from their home gardens, we created the opportunity for markets. They realized that people would come and buy produce. And then when someone went to Nepal, they realized the produce was sold, you know, they were only getting a fraction of what the food was worth. So we gave them literacy and numeracy. We helped them to set up a little growers co-op. And in the peak of the growing season, there was 10 trucks a week that were taking produce to Nepal, and that created income. Then they said to us, well, you know, we would like to improve the road for the trucks to come in. We'd like a clinic in our community. So they wanted to raise money, so we taught them how to raise money and how to save. And I think it was around $150,000 that they needed. And so they were able to raise that money. We gave them some seedy money, but they were able to raise it themselves. And then they had bigger dreams. They wanted a school and they wanted other community buildings. And they came up with a list which was now around about $1 million US. And you know, they didn't come back to us for that. They actually did it themselves.
Wow.
We were able to move on to another community. So it's 13 years summarized, but now that community is a strong community with community services, with schools, with healthcare, and they did it themselves.
You kind of showed them the way they
and that's what development's about.
So praise the Lord.
Yeah.
Having said that, I suspect ADRA is recognized by some of these international agencies, UN, FEMA. They know what you're doing. They have a respect for what you're doing.
They do, you know, and it's humbling for me as the president of ADRA to go to some of these meetings and so forth and to hear the wonderful things that they've got to say about the agency. And ADRA has a very, very strong reputation in service delivery, in doing projects. But we're having to reframe ourselves a little bit as well, because there is a changing trend from being a service delivery agency to being an influencer. You know, you can say, all right, you know, we had a 5-year project and all the homes in 10,000 families now have food. So, yeah, but what about the rest of the country? What have you done to influence public policy? You know, could we do it differently in the future? And so what we're learning is we're learning to professionalize the development work. We're partnering with Adventist institutions of higher education, with some of our Adventist universities and others. We're getting into more research. You need to be able to produce white papers. You need to be at the table when we're thinking, what can we do? What is different? And if you're at that table, then you can influence.
Precisely.
And if you believe that you have values and you have things to influence, then you be at that table. And so there's that little bit of professionalization and operating on a bigger scale that ADRA's always been great at the delivery. But now we've also got to recognize that we need to, what does it mean to be you know, an influencer, and what does it mean to give your voice to something? Because you know, we haven't had a strong advocacy department, and yet when we look at it, you know, we are told scripturally to give a voice to the voiceless, and Christ himself was an advocate for change, and it was really his advocacy, his speaking out, that led to his crucifixion. And if I am his follower, then how can I remain silent?
Yes.
In a world of injustice.
Yes.
And you know, we can personalize it, but you know, look at the scale. It takes $8 billion to provide education for everybody in the world. But we don't do it.
Yes.
Yeah, Americans spend $8 billion a year on cosmetics. You know, it takes $11 billion a year to provide safe water and sanitation for everyone in the world, and yet we don't do it.
Yeah.
But Americans and Europeans combined spend $11 billion a year on ice cream. You know, we spend $480 billion a year on military, but we don't spend the money that's necessary to bring about the social reform. And so we live in a society which doesn't lack resources. But how do we actually become an influence within that society to create you know, this forum? And I believe that, you know, we have that role. As Christians and as an agency, you know, we don't just serve Christians, we serve everybody. Sure. You know, the philosophy that drives me is my Christian philosophy, but the reality is that we serve everybody because they need it, regardless.
Yes, the need is there. And I think I see this, I don't know if it's a subtle shift. When we think of ADRA, we've always thought of ADRA as relief agency. Come in after a mess and mop up.
Right.
You're moving more to the development part, that we want to do things that are sustainable long term, but also influence the culture so that these countries, these governments can help themselves and make life better for their own people systematically, as opposed to just putting out fires and dealing with crisis. So well, the tent is getting bigger. The umbrella is getting bigger. You're covering more than you were before.
It is.
Yeah.
And you know, we fortunately are part of a global church, which has you know, the second biggest healthcare system in the world, the second biggest education system in the world, and you know, we need to learn how to use those assets, and how do we as a church at large, and Adventist, you know, Development and Relief Agency as its agency, how do we actually play that role? Because it's the role and the commission that we've been given.
Yeah. Two questions I want to get you, and I look at the clock on the wall is saying we got to kind of push forward. You are reaching out in a special way to involve young people in your, you know, you and I have gray hair. Well, you have gray hair. I guess if I let the one hair grow, it would be gray.
I'm fast using you as my role model.
But the idea of including young people so that what we're doing is sustainable into the future, talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So we've launched a program called ADRA Connections, and it gives young people the opportunity to do mission trips with ADRA. So they're hosted by the local ADRA office. They're given the opportunity to understand the culture. They're given the exposure to poverty, and they're also given the chance to intervene and to learn what does it actually mean to actually, you know, serve, and how do we actually impact on it. And then, of course, they're given a chance to do a little bit of cultural exploration and discover it. And in fact, you know, next year we are trying for a mega program. So we are going into the Amazon. We're going up the Amazon to a very remote area that has no education.
Wow.
We're partnering with 9 of the Adventist institutions of higher education. We're going to be in there for 3 weeks, and in 3 weeks we are going to build an entire school complex, over 12 buildings. We're going from K to 12, as we say, with classrooms, labs, everything else, play fields, and accommodation for the teachers. And we're bringing education to this part of the Amazon that didn't have Amazon at all. We're going to be working with around 500 Adventist students who are going to just revolutionize this particular part of the Amazon. And that's the exciting thing when you work with young people. Like, who would take on a challenge like that except for young people who have so much energy, who aren't concerned about, well, what if it doesn't work? It's, well, we're just going to make it happen.
It's going to work,
and that's the great thing of young people. They've got such energy and such innovation, and, you know, it's a privilege to be able to provide them with some resources and tools to be able to actually understand their role, that they can make a difference in the world.
One of the things I'm discovering again and anew is that ADRA does so many work, has so many things and has its tentacles, if I can use that terminology, in so many things. We think of building, we think of Maranatha and those kind of things, but ADRA is doing building and that kind of stuff also as part of your overall mandate when you come into an area.
Yes, I mean, we tend not to focus a great deal on building, but where there is the need, we work with that. You know, we're trying to refocus ourselves a little bit in that it's very difficult to be a generalist across everything. So what is it that your agency is known for? So what we're focusing on is we're saying, okay, we're going to develop expertise in the areas of health, education and livelihoods.
Praise the Lord.
Now you think that the Adventist Church is strong in those areas, but if we can provide good health, then children when they are born can be given the opportunity for proper growth, for development, for intellectual and for physical opportunities. Parents won't release their children to education while they're in poverty because they need the children to survive. So if we don't do something about creating livelihood opportunities, then the kids don't get the opportunity. So give them a good, healthy start in life where they can, you know, have all the opportunities that God wants for them to achieve. And then create the opportunity for the families to be able to free them for education and then provide educational opportunities. Because education is the key to unlock poverty. And overarchingly, you know, because we are a faith-based agency, our overarching theme is a sense of well-being. So how do we restore the wholeness of a community? And you know, the wholeness is not just about food. It's about the spiritual development of the people as well. Now I have a definition of spirituality, which is my definition of spirituality, but everybody is created in God's image. Everybody is a spiritual being. How do I give them that opportunity to develop socially, mentally, spiritually, holistically? And that's what I want ADRA to be known as, an agency which brings wholeness and complete healing to communities. And so that's really where we're trying to focus the agency into the future.
I've got two things, and I'm gauging myself with my time, that I think I want you to do on the back end. One, what is ADRA doing in the 1040 window in those countries where it's tough to work? And then we want to take a look at what is on the docket for the future. So before you answer those questions, I think we'll go to our address roll round. Should you want to make contact with ADRA, should you want to know more about what they're doing, and if you want to give financial support to this most worthy of Adventist agencies, we're going to give you the information. Here's how you can do precisely that. Then we'll go to our news break. Then we'll come back and we'll have Jonathan wrestle with those last two questions I gave him. Just now, the address roll and the information that you will need.
The Adventist Development and Relief Agency is the global humanitarian organization of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Through an international network, they deliver relief and development assistance to people in more than 130 countries. Help ADRA International relieve poverty and distress and create just and positive change by visiting adra.org or calling them at 800-424-2372. You may also write to them at 12501 Old Columbia Pike, Silver Spring, Maryland, 20904.
And that is good information. Jonathan, when we left, we're going to talk about the Middle East, and we hear so much about that, and then sort of a little picture of what the future for ADRA is.
You know, I love working in the Middle East, and I think I love working in the Middle East because I'm a spiritual person, and I find that I can make a spiritual connection with the people there, and that has actually enabled us to be in areas that not every NGO is working in. So we're working in Sudan, and recently when I visited Sudan, we were given an award by the Sudanese government. First time they've done that for a Western organization. Because of the way that we work. They say if we want to affect change in the community, we know that we need to work with ADRA because you're in those communities. We're inside Syria, which, as you can imagine, is not particularly easy, but we've got a good relationship and we're able to work effectively there as well. We're inside Yemen, which is challenging with the war-torn things and things happening there, but the staff have been really faithful and stayed throughout that time, and we're running significant programs there. We're running about a $35 million a year program in Yemen at the moment, trying to help stability for people amongst all the instability. How do you bring that stability into their lives that gives them hope? hope. So throughout the Middle East, it's a real honor and a pleasure to be able to work there, and it's to be trusted there.
Yes.
Because, you know, there's agencies that have been asked to leave, but we've been one of the few that has been seen to be a good partner there.
Praise the Lord. And the future? You
know, the future of ADRA, I believe, is really comes down to our name, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency.
Yes.
You know, as we said earlier, there is 95% of or 85% of the world's population is affiliated with some form of religion, and the way to change society is through faith leaders.
Amen.
And how do we ignite and how do we resource our church communities to be agents of change and hope within our own communities? Because as an agency, I have 7,000 staff. You know, I'm in 140 countries.
Yes.
But my resources are finite, and the greatest resource is people.
Yes.
And how do we actually engage with people, give them that sense of mission and purpose to be the agents of hope and change in their own community? And so, you know, as much as we have plans for how do we develop ourselves professionally, I think it's how do we actually partner with church?
Yes, yes. Wonderful interview. This is a wonderful agency, and we thank Jonathan so very, very much. Our time has fast slipped into eternity, and now we allow in closing to wish you both grace and peace through our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye, and God bless.